The wind spoke first. It was a dry, restless sound that whispered through the tall prairie grass, making the land hiss like a serpent. For weeks, it had been the only voice in this part of the territory, a constant companion to the sun that baked the earth into a cracked and thirsty hide. Dusk was bleeding across the horizon, painting the vast, empty sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. It was a beautiful, lonely time of day, the kind of quiet that could settle a soul or break it. Tonight, the wind carried a different message. It carried the scent of smoke. Clara Hensley smelled it first from the kitchen, where she was kneading dough for the morning's bread. Her hands, dusted with flour, stilled over the lump of dough. It was not the familiar, comforting smell of her own hearth fire or the distant, hazy smoke from a neighbor's chimney miles away. This was a hungry smell. It was sharp and acrid, with an undertone of burning pine and something else, something wild and ravenous. Her heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped to the door, pushing it open to look out at the coming night. To the west, the sunset was no longer beautiful. It was terrifying. A wall of angry orange light billowed beneath a rolling black cloud, an unnatural dawn rising at the wrong end of the day. The prairie fire was moving faster than a galloping horse, consuming the dry grass with a low, guttural roar that was growing louder with every passing second. It was not a line of fire. It was an ocean, a rolling, unstoppable tide of flame that stretched for miles in either direction. And it was coming directly for their homestead. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. "Samuel!" she screamed, her voice thin against the rising wind. Her son, barely 4 years old, was playing with wooden blocks on the floor by the hearth. He looked up, his blue eyes wide with confusion. Not fear. He did not yet understand the monster that was coming for them. There was no time to think, only to act. Her mind, which had been a placid pool of domestic thoughts moments before, was now a frantic storm. The horse, the wagon, possessions, Samuel. The order of things scrambled in her head. She scooped her son into her arms, his small body warm and solid against her chest. "We have to go, sweet boy. We have to go now." She ran with him to the small barn, the wind whipping her skirts around her legs and throwing sparks into the air like malevolent fireflies. The heat was already growing, a palpable thing that pressed against her skin. The horse, a sturdy mare named Bess, was whinnying in her stall, her eyes rolling with terror at the smell of smoke and the blood-red glow that was starting to illuminate the yard. Clara's hands trembled as she fumbled with the latch on the stall door. The air was becoming thick, making each breath a searing effort. "Easy, girl, easy," she murmured, her voice choked with smoke and fear. She tried to back the horse out, but Bess would not budge, her hooves planted in the dirt, her body rigid with animal dread. The roar of the fire was a physical force now, a continuous, deafening thunder that vibrated through the ground. She had to leave the horse. There was no time. Back in the cabin, the air was already hazy. Smoke seeped through the cracks in the log walls. "Stay by the door, Samuel," she commanded, her voice harsher than she intended. He began to cry, a frightened, wailing sound that tore at her heart. She had to save something. Anything. Her husband, John, had built this house with his own hands. Every piece of furniture, every dish, every faded quilt held a memory. Her eyes fell on the small wooden chest where they kept their important papers and the few dollars they had saved. She dragged it toward the door. Then her gaze caught on John's photograph on the mantel, his steady, kind face looking out at her. She snatched it, her fingers leaving a dusty print on the glass. The heat was intensifying, the log walls beginning to feel warm to the touch. The air crackled. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed the door shut, and in the same instant, the lantern hanging by the window swayed, slipped from its hook, and shattered on the floor. Oil and flame spread across the wooden planks in a hungry whoosh of light. Clara screamed. The fire was no longer outside. It was inside with them. It moved with an impossible speed, climbing the curtains, licking at the edges of the rug, devouring the dry wood of the table. The room filled with a blinding, choking blackness. She could no longer see her son. "Samuel!" she shrieked, her throat raw. She dropped the photograph and stumbled through the smoke, her hands outstretched, searching blindly. She found him huddled near the wall, coughing and sobbing. She grabbed him, her arms wrapping around him like a shield, and turned toward the door. The fire was already there, a solid wall of orange and yellow blocking their escape. The back window, there was a small window in their bedroom. She ran, pulling Samuel along, her lungs burning, her eyes streaming tears. The heat was a living beast, clawing at her back. She threw herself against the small wooden shutter, splintering the latch, and pushed it open. Outside, the world was an inferno. The barn was already engulfed, its frame a skeleton of black timber against the raging flames. She pushed Samuel through the opening first, then scrambled out after him, her dress catching on a nail and tearing from hem to waist. They were out, but they were not safe. The air was a furnace, filled with a blizzard of glowing embers. She ran, her only thought to put distance between them and the burning house, to get to the creek at the edge of their property. She held Samuel tight, his face buried in her shoulder. She did not know how far they ran. The world was a blur of fire and shadow, a roaring chaos that consumed all thought. Then she stumbled, her foot catching on an exposed root. She fell hard, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. Samuel was thrown from her arms, rolling a few feet away. She gasped, trying to call his name, but no sound came out. She pushed herself up, crawling toward him, her hands scraping against the hot, scorched earth. He was so still. She reached him just as the roof of their cabin gave way. With a groan of tortured timber, it collapsed inward, sending a volcano of sparks and fireballs into the night sky. The sound was like the end of the world. Clara knelt in the dirt, the inferno lighting her horrified face. She saw the small, blue blanket she had knitted for Samuel lying near him, its edges blackened and smoldering. She reached for it, her fingers closing around the scorched wool. She pulled her son into her lap, rocking him back and forth. But he was limp, his small body unresponsive. The roar of the fire began to fade, replaced by a buzzing in her own ears. The world tilted, went dark, and she knew no more. When the neighbors arrived, drawn by the hellish glow in the sky, it was too late. The fire had already swept past, leaving behind a blackened, smoldering wasteland where the Hensley homestead had once stood. The wind had died, and a terrible, unnatural silence had fallen over the land. All that remained of the cabin was a smoking pile of rubble and a solitary stone chimney reaching toward the smoke-filled sky like a tombstone. They found Clara near the creek, half conscious and covered in a thick layer of soot that made her look like a ghost risen from the ashes. Her hair was singed, her face was streaked with black tears, and her hands were raw with blisters. She was kneeling, clutching a child's burned blanket to her chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world, her vacant eyes staring at the ruin of her home. In her lap lay the small, still body of her son. The men took off their hats, their weathered faces grim. The women began to weep, quiet, heartbroken sounds in the devastating stillness. They gently took the boy from her arms, but she would not let go of the blanket. Her grip was like iron. The fire had been a spectacle of horrifying power, a symphony of destruction. It had roared and crackled, hissed and boomed. It had smelled of burning pine, of melting pitch, of life being turned to ash. The heat had been an oppressive weight, so intense it felt as if the very air was on fire. But the silence that followed was worse. It was a hollow, empty thing, a void where laughter, birdsong, and the simple sounds of life had once been. It was the silence of absolute loss. Days later, The small community gathered to bury Samuel Hensley in the town's modest churchyard. The preacher, a stern man with eyes that saw sin everywhere, stood over the small, freshly dug grave and spoke of God's mysterious ways. He called the fire an act of divine will, a trial sent to test the faithful. He spoke of judgment and redemption. The words washed over Clara, meaningless and cruel. In her mind, there was no mystery, no act of God. There was only the image of a lantern, swinging gently on its hook by the window. She had lit it just before dusk. She had meant to move it, to place it safely in the center of the table before John came home from his trip to Laramie. But she had forgotten. The bread, the chores, the simple rhythm of the evening had pushed the thought from her mind. Her guilt was a cold, heavy stone in her chest. It was a certainty more solid than any faith. While the preacher spoke of God's hand, she saw only her own, her carelessness, her failure. She stood by the grave, dry-eyed and detached, feeling as if she were watching the scene from a great distance. The townspeople murmured their condolences, their faces etched with pity, but their words could not reach her. She was encased in a shell of shock and silence. She could not cry. The tears had been burned away, leaving only a dry, aching emptiness behind. After the funeral, she returned not to the neighbor's house where she had been staying, but to the site of her former home. The ashes were cold now. She walked through the debris, her worn boots crunching on charred wood. Nothing was left. The photograph of her husband was gone. The wooden chest was a heap of blackened metal hinges. Everything that had made up her world was now just a layer of gray dust on the wind. She did not know when the decision was made. It was not a thought so much as an impulse, a deep, primal need to move, to walk away from the silence and the ghosts. She turned her back on the ruin and set out into the open plains, with no destination in mind. She just walked. The sun beat down on her head, and the endless horizon stretched out before her, a flat, unforgiving line. Her dress, still torn from the escape, flapped against her legs. She walked toward nowhere, a solitary figure in a vast, indifferent landscape, leaving the only world she had ever known behind. For 2 days, she wandered. Thirst became a fire in her throat, and hunger a hollow ache in her stomach. The sun burned her skin, and the cold nights left her shivering. She was walking, but she was already a ghost, haunted by the smell of smoke and the feel of a small, limp body in her arms. Luke Mercer saw her from a distance, a dark speck moving unsteadily across the pale, sun-bleached land. He had been on the trail for 3 weeks, pushing a small herd of cattle back to his ranch after a long drive south. He was a man accustomed to solitude, more comfortable with the company of horses and open sky than with people. He was tall and lean, with a quiet watchfulness in his gray eyes and a face weathered by sun and hardship. He reined in his horse, squinting against the glare. It was a woman, walking alone and with a strange, stumbling gait. No wagon, no horse, nothing. That was wrong, dangerously wrong. He nudged his horse into a slow trot, closing the distance. As he drew nearer, he could see the state she was in. Her dress was ripped and filthy. Her face was smudged with dirt and streaked with sun-dried tears. Her hair was a tangled mess, and she walked with the empty, aimless shuffle of someone who had given up. He saw her falter, her knees buckling, and then she collapsed in a heap near the shallow, muddy banks of a creek. He dismounted and approached her cautiously, his footsteps soft in the dirt. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow. He knelt beside her and saw the truth of her ordeal. Her boots were scorched, the leather cracked and peeling away from the soles. Her hands were a mess of blisters, some broken and weeping, others red and raw. She had walked through fire and then walked until she could walk no more. He gently turned her over. Her face was pale beneath the grime, her lips cracked and dry. There was an emptiness in her expression even in unconsciousness, a look of such profound desolation that it made his own weary heart ache. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers after a battle, in the faces of men who had lost everything. He did not know her story, but he knew its ending. It was written all over her. With a quiet sigh, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, as fragile as a bird. He carried her to his horse, mounted, and settled her in front of him, her head resting against his chest. He pulled his canteen from his saddle and let a few drops of water fall onto her lips. She stirred, moaning softly, but did not wake. He wrapped his own worn blanket around her and turned his horse toward home, a small, isolated cabin a few hours to the north. He brought her to his cabin without a word. It was a simple, sturdy structure made of rough-hewn logs, sitting alone in a wide, empty valley. Inside, it was clean and sparse, containing little more than a bed, a stone hearth, a table, and 2 chairs. It was the home of a man who needed little and expected less. He laid her gently on the cot, her small frame looking lost in the coarse wool blankets. He removed her ruined boots and tended to her blistered hands as best he could with a soft cloth and some salve. He worked in silence, his movements economical and gentle. When he was done, he sat in the chair by the hearth and simply watched her, his expression unreadable. His voice, when he finally spoke to the sleeping woman, was rough from disuse but steady. "Rest now," he said, more to the quiet room than to her. Just rest. That night, the nightmares came for her. She was back in the fire, the heat suffocating her, the smoke filling her lungs. She could hear Samuel crying for her, but she could not find him in the darkness. She thrashed on the cot, her legs kicking, her hands gripping the blankets. A name, a plea, tore from her throat in a strangled sob. The terror was so real, so absolute, that it finally ripped her from sleep. Her eyes flew open. She was gasping for air, her body drenched in a cold sweat. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The room was dark, save for the soft, flickering glow of a low fire in the hearth. A figure was sitting in a chair beside it, his silhouette broad and still. Panic seized her. She tried to sit up, a whimper escaping her lips. The man did not move toward her. He simply sat there, his presence a quiet anchor in the terrifying dark. In the dim light, she could see that he was mending something. It was her shawl, the one she'd been wearing when she fled the house. It was scorched and torn, but his large, rough hands were carefully stitching the frayed edges together with a needle and thread. The sight was so unexpected, so strangely tender, that it stopped her panic cold. He was not a threat. He was a guardian. He had pulled her from the wilderness, tended her wounds, and was now mending the last tattered piece of her old life. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warmth gentle. Not ravenous, but in her fevered, frightened mind. Fire was still the enemy. It was the thing that had taken everything. It was the thing that was still consuming her from the inside out. She began to tremble, a deep, uncontrollable shivering that shook her entire body. She looked at the silent man by the fire, a stranger who had saved her, and whispered the first words she had spoken in days. Her voice was a dry, broken rasp, full of a confusion and fear she could not name. "Please," she shivered, her eyes wide with a terror that saw flames in every shadow. "Please don't leave me burning." Luke Mercer stopped his sewing. He looked at her across the quiet room, his gray eyes seeing not just the trembling woman on the cot, but the inferno that still raged behind her eyes. He offered no words of comfort, no empty promises that everything would be all right. He knew better. Instead, he reached for the iron poker leaning against the hearth. He rose slowly, and with a quiet, deliberate movement, he stirred the fire, pushing the glowing logs apart, taming the flames until they were nothing more than a soft, warm ember. He made sure its heat could comfort, but never hurt her again. He did not answer her plea with words. He answered it with silence, and with an act of quiet, profound understanding. The first days were a blur of silent hours. Clara moved through Luke Mercer's cabin like a phantom. a ghost haunting the edges of his solitary life. Her body began to heal. The blisters on her hands scabbed over and slowly faded into pink, tender skin. The raw weariness in her bones gave way to a dull, persistent ache. But the wounds on the inside remained deep and festering. She did not speak. The fire had burned the words from her, leaving only a hollow silence where a life had once been. She spent most of her time sitting in the chair by the single window, staring out at the vast, sun-bleached prairie. The view from Luke's cabin was one of profound and unending emptiness. The land stretched out in every direction, a rolling sea of dry, brown grass under a pale, washed-out sky. There were no trees to break the horizon, no neighboring homesteads to offer a comforting curl of smoke. There was only the land, the sky, and the wind. For Clara, it was a mirror of the emptiness inside her own soul. It was a landscape of loss. Luke gave her the one thing she needed more than food or shelter: space. He was a man carved from the same quiet, stoic material as the land itself. He moved with a deliberate economy of motion, his presence steady and unobtrusive. He spoke in few words, his voice a low rumble that never demanded a reply. He would rise before the sun, his quiet movements in the small cabin a gentle rousing from her troubled sleep. He would tend to his small herd of cattle, their distant lowing the only sound for miles. He spent his days repairing the sections of fence that the fire's wind had torn down. His hammer blows a distant, rhythmic heartbeat against the silence. He would leave food for her on the table, a bowl of oatmeal in the morning, a piece of hardtack and dried meat at midday. He never pressed her to eat, but he watched, his gray eyes missing nothing. He saw the way she picked at her food, the way her gaze would drift back to the window, her eyes focused on something far beyond the horizon. He saw the tremors that still shook her hands when she thought no one was looking. He did not offer comfort or pity. He simply offered his quiet, constant presence, a bulwark against the vast loneliness that threatened to swallow her whole. The isolation of the ranch was a living thing. The days were ruled by the sun and the dust. Great towering storms of it would roll in from the west, vast ghostly clouds that turned the sky a murky brown and coated every surface in a fine layer of grit. The wind was a constant mourner, its low, keening cry weaving through the eaves of the cabin. At night, the world shrank to the small circle of light cast by a single lamp, and the darkness outside came alive with the yipping and howling of coyotes. Their lonely cries echoed Clara's own unshed tears, a wild and sorrowful music that seeped into her dreams. Slowly, tentatively, she began to move. The idleness was a poison, giving her mind too much room to circle back to the smoke and the screams. One morning, she picked up the water bucket and carried it to the well. The rope was coarse against her healing hands, and the weight of the full bucket made her shoulders burn. But the physical strain was a welcome distraction. It was real. It was something to focus on besides the searing images in her memory. From there, she found other small tasks. She took to cleaning Luke's tools, wiping the grease and dust from the wrenches and hammers, arranging them in neat rows on his workbench. She found a needle and thread in a small tin box and began patching the old, faded curtains that hung in the window. The simple, repetitive motion of the needle moving in and out of the fabric was calming. It was an act of mending, of putting something broken back together, and it gave her a sliver of peace. Each small chore was a step, a tiny rebellion against the crushing weight of her grief. She was finding a strange and unexpected comfort in the steady routine of a life that was not her own. One afternoon, while tidying the few books on a dusty shelf, her fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound frame tucked behind a thick volume on animal husbandry. She pulled it out. It was an old photograph. The image faded to shades of sepia and gray. It showed Luke, younger and with a rare, small smile on his face. Standing beside him was a woman with kind eyes and dark hair piled high on her head. In front of them, sitting on a small stool, was a little girl with a serious expression and a large ribbon in her hair. They looked like a family, a happy one. She was holding it when Luke came in from the fields, his face streaked with dust. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the photograph in her hands. His face, usually so placid, tightened. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken things. I was just dusting," Clara whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. He walked over and took the frame from her hands, his touch gentle but firm. He stared at the image for a long moment, his thumb brushing over the glass as if to wipe away the years. His expression was one of profound, bottomless sorrow. "They're gone," he said, his voice flat and empty. He offered no more explanation. He did not say when, or how, or why. He simply placed the photograph back on the shelf, turning its face to the wall, and walked back outside, leaving Clara alone with the weight of a grief that she now understood was not hers alone. She realized then that they were two ghosts haunting the same house, each tethered to the world by a loss they could not speak of. Their fragile peace was shattered one evening a week later. Luke had brought in a rabbit, and Clara had offered to cook it, wanting to contribute something more than mended curtains. She was standing over the hearth, stirring a stew in a heavy iron pot. The smell of the simmering meat and wild herbs filled the cabin, a comforting, domestic aroma. But she was distracted, her mind wandering, and the fire was hotter than she realized. A piece of fat dripped from the spoon onto the hot stones of the hearth, sizzling and sending up a tiny, acrid wisp of smoke. The smell hit her first. It was the smell of burning. Instantly, the cabin vanished. She was no longer in Luke's quiet home. She was back in the inferno, the air thick and black, the heat searing her skin. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, panicked bird beating its wings against a cage. The low crackle of the hearth became the roar of a house being devoured by flames. She could feel the heat on her back, could hear the splintering groan of collapsing timber. In her panic, she burned her fingers on the hot handle of the pot. The sharp sting of pain was the final trigger. A choked cry escaped her lips, and she threw the pot aside. It crashed to the floor, spilling stew across the stone. She stumbled backward, her hands flying to her face, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. She was drenched in a cold sweat, her body shaking uncontrollably. The fire in the hearth, moments before a source of warmth, was now a monster, its flickering light a dance of malevolent spirits. Luke was outside, splitting wood, but the crash of the pot brought him running. He burst through the door to find her backed into a corner of the room, her eyes wide with a terror that was not of this world. She was shaking from head to foot, her knuckles white where she gripped her own arms. He saw the spilled stew, smelled the faint scent of scorched meat, and understood immediately. He did not rush to her. He moved slowly, deliberately, as he had when he found her by the creek. He walked to the hearth and, using a pair of tongs, carefully removed the burning logs, placing them in the stone ash bucket. He doused them with water, and the fire hissed into darkness, leaving only the dying orange glow of the embers. Only then did he approach her. He said nothing. He simply stood before her and gently took her trembling hands in his own. His hands were large, calloused, and incredibly steady. He held hers, his grip firm but not confining, an anchor in the storm that was raging inside her. He did not try to soothe her with words. He just held her, his quiet strength flowing into her, a silent promise that he would not let her be consumed. She stood there, her ragged breath slowly evening out, the frantic pounding of her heart gradually subsiding. She focused on the feeling of his hands around hers, on the solid, unshakable presence of the man before her. He smelled of pine and dust and sweat, the smell of the living world. Slowly, the images of fire receded, and the cabin came back into focus. She was safe. The fire was gone. She was shaking, exhausted, and utterly ashamed, but she was safe. And she was not alone. In the silent aftermath of her panic, their bond deepened. It was a connection forged not in conversation or laughter, but in a shared, unspoken understanding. They were two people who had been touched by fire, both literally and figuratively. They both sought warmth, but had learned to fear the flame. They moved around each other with a quiet, careful grace, each recognizing the unhealed burns on the other's soul. News of the woman staying at Luke Mercer's ranch traveled slowly, but it traveled surely. In the small, dusty town of Redemption, a day's ride away, whispers began to circulate. Tongues clucked in disapproval over cracker barrels at the general store and in the pews of the church on Sunday morning. A widow, not yet a month after burying her child, living with a solitary rancher. It was improper. It was a sin. The whispers grew cruel, colored by the harsh judgment of people whose lives were governed by rigid rules and a deep-seated fear of anything that strayed from the ordinary. One afternoon, an old friend of Luke's, a grizzled drover named Silas Blackwood, rode out to the ranch. He and Luke had ridden together for years, and he was one of the few people Luke considered a friend. He found Luke replacing a post on the corral. "Luke," Silas said, dismounting and leaning against the fence. "Folks are talking." Luke did not stop his work. He set a nail and drove it home with two clean, powerful strikes of his hammer. "Folks always talk. Silas, it's what they do when they ain't got enough work." "This is different," Silas pressed, his voice low. "They're saying things about you, about the widow. The preacher's wife is calling her a Jezebel. The men are making coarse jokes. It ain't right, but you know how people are. They'll make her life a misery if she ever tries to come back to town." Luke finished with the nail and finally turned to face his friend. His expression was hard, his gray eyes cold as river stones. He looked past Silas, his gaze fixed on the cabin, where he could see Clara's silhouette moving past the window. "They can say what they want," Luke said, his voice quiet but laced with a dangerous intensity. "They can sit in their church and judge and whisper all they like, but they weren't there when the fire came. They didn't see what was lost. They've got no right to judge a soul that's already burned." Silas held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He understood. This was not about sin or impropriety. It was about survival. He clapped Luke on the shoulder, mounted his horse, and rode away without another word. The drought that had held the land in its grip for months finally broke late one afternoon. The sky, which had been a relentless, empty blue for as long as anyone could remember, began to fill with bruised, purple clouds. The wind picked up, but this time it did not carry the scent of dust and fire. It carried the smell of ozone, of damp earth, of life-giving water. The first drops of rain were fat and heavy, spattering against the dry ground and raising little puffs of dust. Then, as if a dam in the heavens had burst, the sky opened up. Rain fell in a solid gray sheet, a torrential downpour that hammered on the cabin's roof and turned the dusty yard into a churning sea of mud. It was a violent, glorious, and desperately needed deluge. Clara stood at the open doorway, watching the storm. Luke was beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. The sound of the rain was deafening, a roar that drowned out the coyotes, the wind, and the ghosts. It was the sound of cleansing, of renewal. On an impulse she did not understand, Clara stepped out from under the shelter of the porch roof. She was barefoot, the cold, thick mud squelched between her toes, a shocking, grounding sensation. She lifted her face to the sky, closing her eyes as the rain streamed down her face, washing away the layers of dust and soot that felt as if they had been clinging to her for an eternity. It plastered her hair to her scalp and soaked her simple dress, but she did not care. Each drop felt like a blessing, like forgiveness. She felt as if the ashes that had been choking her spirit were finally being washed away, leaving her raw and clean and new. Luke watched her from the doorway. He saw the tension in her shoulders release. saw the faintest hint of a smile touch her lips. She was not a ghost in that moment. She was a woman, standing in the rain, reconnecting with a world she had turned her back on. And as he watched her, he felt something shift deep inside his own shuttered heart. It was a feeling he had not allowed himself to have in a very long time. It was hope, fragile and dangerous, but there all the same. The rain was not just washing away her ashes. It was watering a seed of life that he had thought long dead within himself. The rain gave way to a crisp autumn air that sharpened the edges of the distant hills and turned the prairie grass from a sun-scorched brown to a deep, burnished gold. The change in the season seemed to usher in a change in Clara. The heavy, suffocating blanket of her grief began to feel a little lighter. It was still there, a constant companion, but it no longer consumed all the air in her lungs. The silence that had encased her for so long began to crack. The first time she laughed, the sound was so foreign it startled them both. Luke was attempting to reshoe his horse, Bess, who was in a particularly stubborn mood. After the 5th time the mare had kicked the hoof stand over, Luke had let out a long, weary sigh and muttered to the horse, "Woman, you have got more opinions than the United States Congress." The comment was so dry, so utterly defeated, that a small, breathy sound escaped Clara's lips. It was barely a chuckle, more like a rusty hinge creaking open. But it was there. Luke stopped, his head tilted, and looked at her. A slow, faint smile touched the corners of his mouth. He did not say anything, did not draw attention to the fragile sound, but in that shared moment, a wall that had stood between them crumbled into dust. Seeing the life return to her eyes, however faint, spurred Luke to action. "You need to learn to ride," he announced one morning, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This ain't land for walking." He started her on Bess, the gentlest animal he owned. At first, she was terrified. The height from the saddle felt precarious, the power of the animal beneath her overwhelming. Her hands, still tender from her burns, gripped the reins with a desperate tightness. But Luke was a patient teacher. He walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on the bridle, his voice a low, steady murmur of instruction and encouragement. "Feel the horse move with you," he'd say. "Don't fight her. You're partners." Slowly, her fear gave way to a sense of freedom she had never known. Their rides became a daily ritual, a shared escape from the confines of the small cabin and the even smaller confines of their memories. They would ride for hours, exploring the vast, empty country that was Luke's home. He showed her the hidden springs where the deer came to drink at dawn, the high bluffs that offered a view for 100 miles, and the quiet, cottonwood-lined creek beds that were invisible from a distance. Out on the open prairie, with the wind in her hair and the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her, Clara felt the grip of the past loosen. The ghosts of smoke and fire could not follow her there. It was during these rides that they began to talk. The words came slowly at first, like a hesitant spring thaw. They spoke of simple things, the weather, the cattle, the way the light changed on the plains at sunset. But the vast, quiet landscape seemed to pull deeper truths from them. One afternoon, they stopped to rest their horses on a ridge overlooking a wide, empty valley. For a long time, they sat in a comfortable silence, watching a hawk circle high in the pale blue sky. "He was a good man," Clara said suddenly, her voice soft. Luke did not have to ask who she meant. He just waited, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "John, my husband, he was kind, but he had a restlessness in him. He was always chasing something. A fortune he was sure was just over the next hill. He built the house, but he was never really in it. He was always gone, looking for a better claim, a richer strike. I think I was lonelier when he was alive than I am now." She confessed this last part in a whisper, a truth so painful she had never before dared to give it voice. She felt a pang of guilt for the disloyalty of the words, but also the strange relief of honesty. Luke was silent for a long time, absorbing her confession without judgment. He reached down, picked up a smooth, flat stone, and turned it over and over in his calloused palm. "Men like that," he said finally, his voice rough. "They're chasing something they can't ever catch, and they don't see what they're leaving behind until it's gone." He tossed the stone, watching it arc through the air before disappearing into the tall grass. The hawk let out a sharp cry overhead. "I was driving a herd up from Texas a few years back," he began, his voice lower now, heavier. "It was a long, hard push. We had a new kid with us, barely 16, full of brag and vinegar, but a good heart. A storm came up on us one night, a real monster. Lightning spooked the herd, a full-blown stampede, in the dark, in the driving rain. It was chaos. The boy's horse went down right in front of me. I tried to get to him. I was reaching for his hand. Luke's own hand clenched into a fist. But the herd, they just swallowed him up. There was nothing I could do. I heard him scream once, and then it was just the thunder of the hooves." He fell silent. The raw pain in his voice was a wound that had never healed. Clara could feel his guilt, a weight as heavy and real as the saddle beneath her. She understood then that his fire had been a storm of hooves in the dark. His failure, the sound of a single, lost scream. Their shared guilt, born of different tragedies, bound them together in that moment with a strength that no words of comfort could ever have achieved. They were both survivors of a moment when they had been powerless to save the person they were meant to protect. She reached out, her hand hesitating for a second before she rested it on his arm. He did not pull away. They sat there for a long time, two solitary figures on a lonely ridge, their silent communion a testament to their shared and broken hearts. Clara found herself watching him more and more. She was drawn to his quiet strength, the way he moved with a purpose that seemed to come from deep within him. But more than that, she was drawn to the way he looked at her. The people in town, and even her neighbors, had looked at her with pity, their eyes seeing only a tragic figure, a woman defined by her loss. They saw the widow, a broken thing. But Luke looked at her and saw Clara. He saw a woman. He saw her strength, not just her sorrow. He spoke to her as an equal, trusted her with chores, and listened when she finally began to speak. In his eyes, she was not a ghost. She was a person, still whole, still human. And for that, she began to feel something she had thought was burned out of her forever, a deep and terrifying tenderness. One night, a chill wind rattled the shutters of the cabin, a reminder that winter was on its way. Luke had built a small, steady fire in the hearth, more for comfort than for heat. He had fallen asleep in his chair, his long frame slumped in exhaustion, a book lying open in his lap. Clara had been sleeping on the cot, but a familiar nightmare, this time of falling embers and the smell of her son's burning blanket, had jolted her awake. She sat up, her heart pounding. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind outside. She saw Luke, asleep in the chair, his head resting against the high back. His hand was dangling over the armrest, his fingers nearly touching the floor. He looked younger in sleep, the hard lines of his face softened by the firelight. He looked vulnerable. She slipped from the cot, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She knelt before the hearth, not for warmth, but just to be near him. She watched the slow, even rise and fall of his chest. His hand was so close to hers, an overwhelming mix of gratitude, affection, and a desperate, aching loneliness washed over her. He had saved her. He had pulled her from the ashes and given her a place to stand. He had held her hands while she trembled and listened to her silence. He was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. Almost without meaning to, her lips formed the words that had become her prayer, her plea, her deepest fear. "Please," she whispered to the sleeping man, her voice a thread of sound in the quiet room. "Please don't leave me burning." He stirred at the sound of her voice. His eyes opened, not with a start, but with a slow, heavy awareness. They were bleary with sleep, but they found hers in the dim light. He did not seem surprised to see her kneeling there. They simply looked at each other for a long, silent moment. The air between them was thick with everything they had shared and everything they had not yet said. The warmth from the fire was on her back, but a different, more intense heat was building between them. It was terrifying. It was tender. He moved slowly, unfolding himself from the chair and kneeling on the floor in front of her. He was so close now she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He raised his hand, his calloused fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before they gently touched her cheek. His touch was electric, sending a shiver through her entire body. It was not a touch of pity, but of reverence, of want. Their first kiss was not a thing of passion, but of desperation. It was uncertain, a hesitant meeting of lips that were both starved for comfort. It was filled with the longing of two souls who had been alone for too long. It tasted of wood smoke and sorrow, of unshed tears and the faint, fragile promise of something new. It was the emotional climax of years of unspoken pain, a silent acknowledgement that they could not heal alone. In that kiss, she was not a widow, and he was not a failure. They were just a man and a woman, seeking shelter from the storm in each other. The next morning, shame washed over Clara in a cold, brutal wave. The sun streamed through the window, bright and unforgiving. The intimacy of the night before felt like a betrayal of John, of Samuel, of the grief that she was supposed to carry like a shroud for the rest of her days. How could she feel such a desperate need for another's touch when her son was lying in the cold ground? The guilt was a physical sickness. She avoided Luke, her eyes downcast, her movements stiff and awkward. She busied herself with chores, her silence returning. But this time it was not empty. It was filled with shame and confusion. Luke seemed to understand. He did not push her, did not even try to meet her eye. He just continued his quiet presence, his movements as steady and predictable as the rising sun. He gave her the space she needed, and his patience was a greater kindness than any words could have been. A few days later, he saddled both horses after breakfast. "Come on," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "There's work to be done." He did not lead her out onto the prairie. He led her back to the place she had been running from. He led her to the charred ruins of her old homestead. She pulled back on the reins, her heart seizing with dread. "No," she whispered. "I can't." "Yes, you can," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "It's time to stop running from it. It's time to build." And so they began. They started by clearing the debris, plank by blackened plank. It was grueling, heartbreaking work. Every piece of charred wood, every twisted piece of metal was a ghost of her former life. But working alongside Luke, she found a new kind of strength. They worked in tandem, a silent, efficient team. He would pry the heavy, burned timbers loose, and she would drag them to a pile to be burned again. This time not in a fire of destruction, but of cleansing. They were not just clearing away the remnants of a tragedy. They were clearing the ground for something new. Their presence at the old Hensley place did not go unnoticed. When they rode into Redemption for supplies, the townsfolk would stop and stare. The whispers that had started months ago now had faces. The women would pull their skirts aside as she passed, their lips pursed in judgment. The men would watch her with a mixture of pity and a crude, leering curiosity. The names followed them like a bitter wind. They called her the Fire Widow. They called him the Fool Rancher, who had taken in a cursed woman. They weathered the insults in silence, their face set like stone, neither of them giving the gossips the satisfaction of a reaction. The cruelty came to a head one evening. They were loading supplies into their wagon when a group of 3 drunk ranch hands stumbled out of the saloon. They were loud and belligerent, looking for trouble. Their eyes landed on Clara. "Well, looky here," one of them sneered. A big man with a pockmarked face named Blevins. "It's the Fire Widow. Heard you like it hot, ma'am." His companions roared with laughter. Clara froze, her face turning pale. Luke, who had been tying down a sack of flour, slowly straightened up. His face was calm, but his eyes were like chips of ice. "That's enough, Blevins," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Get on your way." Blevins was too drunk to heed the warning. He took a swaggering step closer to Clara. "I'm just saying, a woman like her, all alone out there with a quiet fella like you, must get awful cold at night. Maybe she needs a real man to keep her warm." That was all. Luke moved faster than Clara would have thought possible. He did not say another word. His fist shot out, catching Blevins square on the jaw with a sickening crack. The big man stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock, before collapsing in the dusty street. His two friends, momentarily stunned, charged at Luke. What followed was not a brawl, it was a storm of controlled violence. Luke met them head-on, his movements precise and brutal. He was not a saloon brawler. He was a man who knew how to fight, how to end a conflict with grim efficiency. He took a punch to the cheek that split the skin, but he delivered far worse. In less than a minute, it was over. Blevins's friends were on the ground, groaning, and Luke was standing over them, his chest heaving, his knuckles bloody. He had bruises, but he had no regret. He turned to Clara, his face a mask of fury and pain. He ignored the gawking townspeople and gently took her arm. "Let's go home," he said, his voice rough. Back at the cabin, the adrenaline faded, leaving only the throbbing ache of his injuries. He sat at the table while Clara cleaned the cut on his cheek with a wet cloth. Her hands were trembling, not with fear, but with a fierce, protective anger and a deep, aching sorrow. This was her fault. Her tragedy was now his. Her ghosts were now his to fight. Blood trickled from a cut on his lip. The sight of it, so red and vital, made her heart clench. He had bled for her. He had taken on her pain and worn it on his own skin. He winced as she dabbed the cut with the cloth. She looked at his bruised face, at the quiet strength that had risen up to defend her, and her heart felt like it would break. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at the man who had fought for her honor, for her peace. "You shouldn't have," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You shouldn't have to burn for me." Winter did not arrive gently. It descended upon the plains like a conquering army, rolling in on a wave of iron-gray clouds and a wind that carried the sharp, clean scent of ice. The first blizzard buried the world in a pristine, silent blanket of white. And for weeks after, the snow just kept falling. It drifted against the cabin and the barn, smoothed the sharp edges of the land into soft, rolling dunes, and turned the vast prairie into an endless, frozen sea. The rivers and creeks froze solid, their rushing waters silenced beneath a thick crust of ice. The world shrank, the horizon drawing in until their whole existence seemed confined to the small patch of land around Luke's cabin. The isolation, which had once been a quiet companion, was now a profound and oppressive presence. The cold brought a new kind of hardship. One morning, Gus, the weathered ranch hand Luke employed during the busier seasons, packed his meager belonging. He was a superstitious man, his mind filled with the dark omens of his ancestors. He stood in the doorway of the cabin, his hat in his hands, refusing to meet Clara's eyes. "I'm sorry, Luke," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I can't stay. There's a bad feeling on this place. It ain't right." He chanced a quick, fearful glance at Clara. "Folks in town say she's a cursed woman, that the fire follows her. I got a family to think of." Luke's face was grim, but he did not argue. He simply nodded, paid the man his wages, and watched him ride off until he was a tiny speck swallowed by the vast, white emptiness. With Gus gone, the full weight of the ranch fell on Luke's shoulders, and their supplies, already carefully rationed, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. Clara would not stand by and watch Luke work himself to the bone. The woman who had arrived at his doorstep, a fragile ghost of a person, was gone. In her place was a woman forged in the quiet fire of resilience. "I will help," she stated one morning, her tone leaving no room for debate. It was not a request. It was a declaration. She insisted he teach her the hard chores, the work a woman was not expected to do. She learned to break the ice in the water trough with a heavy axe, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She helped him haul hay to the shivering cattle, the coarse stalks scratching her hands, her muscles screaming in protest. She learned to mend a fence in the biting wind, her fingers growing numb around the cold metal of the hammer and staples. The work was brutal, a daily battle against the cold and her own physical limits. But with every task she mastered, she felt a piece of her own strength returning. She was not helpless. She was not a burden. She was a partner. In the quiet hours of the night, when the wind howled outside and Luke was lost in a heavy, exhausted sleep, Clara began to write. He had a small, leather-bound journal tucked away in a drawer, half filled with his own sparse, practical entries about cattle prices and weather patterns. She took it, and on the clean pages, she began her own accounting. It was not a diary of events, but a confession to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. She wrote about the fire. For the first time, she forced herself to put the details into words, the images that haunted her dreams. She wrote about the smell of the smoke, the feel of the heat, the terrible finality of the roof collapsing. She wrote of her guilt, the lantern hanging by the window a constant, burning accusation in her mind, and, with a hesitant, trembling hand, she wrote about Luke. She wrote about his quiet kindness, the steadiness of his presence, the way his gray eyes saw past her scars. She wrote of the confusing, terrifying, and beautiful feelings that were growing in her heart, a fragile bloom of life in the midst of a frozen wasteland. The journal became her sanctuary, the one place she could lay down the unbearable weight of her past and her uncertain future. The outside world intruded on their isolated existence in the form of a letter. A lone rider from the mail depot, his horse struggling through the deep snow, brought it one afternoon. The envelope was addressed to Luke in an elegant, unfamiliar script. He stared at it for a long moment before breaking the seal. As he read, his face hardened, the muscles in his jaw tightening into knots. "It's from my brother," he said, his voice flat. "Elias. He lives back east. A lawyer." There was a world of distance in the way he said the word. "Seems the railroad is pushing west. They've surveyed a line that cuts right through this valley, right through this ranch." He crumpled the letter in his fist. "Elias says they've made a generous offer. He says I should take it. Says there's no point in fighting progress." "What will you do?" Clara asked, her heart sinking. The thought of leaving this place, this small pocket of the world where she had begun to heal, was unbearable. Luke looked past her, out the window at the snow-covered land he had worked for years. His land. "I'm not selling," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "My father built this place from nothing. I buried him and my mother on that hill up there." He paused, and Clara knew he was thinking of the other, smaller graves that must be there as well, the ones marked by the photograph with its face turned to the wall. "I've lost enough homes. I'm not losing another." Clara looked at him, and in the fierce, stubborn set of his jaw, in the burning intensity of his eyes, she saw it. It was the same fire that had once destroyed her life. But in him, it was not just destructive. It was proud. It was stubborn. It was beautiful. It was the fire of a man who would rather be consumed by the flames than give up the things he loved. And she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she would stand in that fire with him. The letter changed things. A new tension settled over the cabin, a sharp edge to the quiet. They argued that night for the first time. It was not a loud, angry fight, but a quiet, desperate clash of fear and pride. Clara, terrified of another loss, pleaded with him to be practical, to consider the danger. Luke, his own fear masked by anger, refused to bend, seeing any compromise as a surrender. The argument ended in a stalemate, leaving them on opposite sides of the hearth, the silence between them heavier than ever. Later, as the embers in the fireplace died down, he came to her cot. He stood over her in the darkness, a tall, lonely silhouette. He did not speak, but she could feel the turmoil rolling off him. She could feel his fear of loss, a fear that mirrored her own. She sat up and reached for his hand. Her touch was all it took. The dam of their restraint, built over months of shared grief and unspoken longing, finally broke. He knelt beside her, pulling her into an embrace that was less about tenderness and more about a desperate, aching need to hold on to something real in a world that was threatening to tear them apart. They came together not in a gentle union, but in a storm of unrestrained passion. It was a collision of loneliness and desire, of fear and hope. It was filled with tears, his and hers, a release of all the pain they had held inside for so long. It was an act of claiming, of two drowning people clinging to the only other soul in the vast, empty ocean of their lives. In the quiet, breathless glow afterward, they lay tangled in the blankets, the warmth of their bodies a small fortress against the cold night. Clara lay with her head on his chest, listening to the steady, slowing rhythm of his heart. The scars on her soul were still there, the ghost of her son, the memory of the fire, the weight of her guilt. They had not vanished. But for the first time, she felt they did not have to. She realized that love did not erase the scars. It simply made it possible to live with them. It was a warmth that could coexist with the burns. Days later, they came, 4 of them, on horseback, their dark coats stark against the snow. They were not ranchers. They were hard-faced men from town, their eyes cold and their mouths set in grim lines. They carried themselves with the easy arrogance of men who were used to getting their way, by persuasion or by force. Luke met them in the yard, telling Clara to stay inside, but she watched from the window, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The man in the lead, a portly man in a city hat, did the talking. His voice was too low for her to hear the words, but his tone was clear. It was a mixture of false politeness and veiled threat. Luke's answers were short, his body rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. The conversation grew more heated. The man's voice rose, and one of his companions moved his coat back, revealing the butt of a pistol holstered at his hip. That was when the brawl erupted. Luke threw the first punch, a hard right that sent the lead man staggering back into the snow. The other 3 swarmed him at once. Luke fought with the same grim efficiency he had shown in town, but this time, the odds were against him. It was a desperate, ugly fight in the snow-dusted yard, a whirlwind of flailing fists and grunts of pain. In the chaos, one of the men was thrown back against the wall of the barn, right next to the door where a single lantern hung, its flame a small, steady beacon against the gray afternoon. The man's flailing arm caught the lantern, knocking it from its hook. It fell to the ground, the glass shattering, the oil spilling across the dry, hay-strewn floor just inside the open barn door. The fire ignited with a hungry whoosh. The flames spread with an unnatural, terrifying speed, feeding on the dry timber and the tons of hay stored inside for the winter. Black smoke began to pour from the doorway. The fight stopped instantly, the men backing away, their faces a mixture of shock and alarm. For a moment, everyone just stared at the impossible sight. A fire in the middle of a frozen world. Then, Luke moved. His horses, Bess and his gelding, were trapped in their stalls at the back of the barn. He let out a choked cry and, without a second's thought, ran toward the burning building. "No!" Clara screamed, her voice tearing from her throat. She threw the cabin door open and ran out onto the porch. "Luke, come back!" But he was already gone, disappearing into the billowing wall of black smoke and orange flame. The scene was a horrifying echo of her past. The smoke, the screams, the hungry orange light of loss, it was all happening again. The roar of the fire was the same sound that had haunted her nightmares. The smell of burning wood and hay was the same smell that had clung to her for months. Her entire body locked up, the old trauma a paralyzing force. She was frozen in time, a helpless witness to the fire once more. The men who had started the fight were already on their horses, their faces pale with fear as they galloped away, leaving their destruction behind them. She was alone with the fire and the man who was trapped inside it. Then something inside her snapped. The ice of her fear shattered, replaced by a white-hot surge of adrenaline and a love so fierce it was more powerful than any terror. This would not happen again. She would not stand by and watch the fire take someone else she loved. She ran. Her feet pounded against the frozen, snow-covered ground as she raced toward the inferno. She tied the hem of her skirt around her nose and mouth and plunged into the smoke-filled doorway without hesitation. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall that seared her lungs and brought tears to her eyes. The barn was a vision of hell, the interior a swirling chaos of fire and smoke. She could hear the terrified screams of the horses and Luke's voice, shouting, trying to calm them. She followed the sound, stumbling through the blinding smoke, her eyes searching desperately. She found him near the back, struggling with the latch on Bess's stall. A heavy timber, glowing red with fire, had fallen, blocking the way. He was choking, his face black with soot, his efforts growing weaker. "Luke!" she screamed, her voice raw. He turned, his eyes wide with disbelief and fury when he saw her. "Clara, get out!" he yelled, his voice cracking in a fit of coughing. "Not without you!" she screamed back. She grabbed his arm, pulling with all her strength. "The horses are gone. We have to go, now!" He resisted for a second, his stubborn pride warring with the primal need to survive. But he was choking on the smoke, his strength failing. He finally let her pull him away, stumbling toward the light of the doorway. Just as they reached the entrance, the main support beam of the roof gave way with a deafening groan. They threw themselves out of the barn and into the snow just as the entire structure collapsed behind them in a fiery, roaring avalanche of timber and flame. They lay there, gasping in the snow, their lungs burning, their bodies trembling. The barn was gone. Their winter hay was gone. His horses were gone. But they were alive. Together, they collapsed in the snow, watching the flames devour what was left of their future, clinging to the only thing they had left, each other. The morning after the fire was a study in gray and black. A funereal silence lay over the valley, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind sifting through the skeletal remains of the barn. What the fire had not consumed, the water used to fight it had frozen into grotesque sculptures of black ice. The ruins smoked gently in the frigid air, a gaping, charred wound on the pristine white landscape. The ranch, which had been a symbol of Luke's solitary endurance, was now a monument to their shared destruction. Their prospects were as grim as the smoldering ashes. Their winter feed was gone, their horses were dead, and the last of their money had been spent on supplies that now lay buried under the wreckage. The fight in town, followed by this disaster, had solidified their status as outcasts. They were pariahs, the cursed woman and the fool rancher, trapped in a winter prison of their own making. Luke had saved her from the fire, but the fire had taken its own revenge on him. He had inhaled too much of the thick, oily smoke, and it had settled deep in his lungs. For days, he lay on the cot, his body racked by a deep, rattling cough that left him breathless and weak. A fever burned in him, making his skin feel hot and dry to the touch, and his sleep was haunted by feverish nightmares that made him cry out for people whose names Clara did not know. Clara tended to him with a fierce, unwavering devotion. The roles were now reversed. He, the strong, silent protector, was now helpless, and she, the fragile survivor, became his anchor. She refused to leave his side. She bathed his face with cool water, forced sips of broth between his cracked lips, and sat through the long, dark nights, her hand resting on his chest, as if she could will her own strength into him through her touch. The sound of his labored breathing was a constant, terrifying reminder of how close she had come to losing him. In those quiet, desperate hours, she did not pray. She made a vow. She would not let him be consumed. She had run into the fire to save his body. She would fight just as hard now to save his life. Word of their misfortune, carried by the same men who had caused it, spread through the territory. A few days into Luke's illness, a new visitor arrived. He was a traveling preacher, a man named Brother Josiah, whose brand of faith was built on a foundation of fire and brimstone. He rode a gaunt horse and had the zealous, burning eyes of a man who saw the devil in every shadow. He found Clara outside, chopping firewood with a grim determination. He dismounted without being invited, his long black coat a stark slash against the snow. "I have heard of the tribulations that have befallen this place," he announced, his voice a sonorous boom that seemed too large for the quiet valley. "The Lord is a jealous God. Woman, He will not suffer the sinner to prosper. Your suffering is a divine punishment for the life of sin you lead, living here in defiance of God's law with this man." Clara stopped, the axe held loosely in her hand. She stared at him, her face a mask of cold fury. The grief that had lived inside her for so long, a passive, aching thing, began to curdle and harden into something else. It was turning into defiance. All the pitying looks, the cruel whispers, the unjust condemnation, it all coalesced into the form of this self-righteous man standing before her. "You know nothing of sin," she said, her voice low and shaking with a rage she had never known she possessed. "And you know nothing of God." "I know that the wages of sin is death," he thundered, pointing a long, bony finger at her. "You have been marked by fire once, and now again. It is the Lord's brand upon you, a warning to turn from your wicked ways before you are cast into the eternal." He never finished the sentence, with a cry that was part rage and part grief. Clara lunged forward. She did not use the axe. She used her bare hands. She shoved him with all the force of her pain and anger, pushing him backward off the small porch. He stumbled, his arms windmilling, and landed with a surprised grunt in a deep snowdrift. "Get off this land!" she snarled, her eyes blazing. She stood on the porch, a warrior queen defending her broken kingdom, her breath coming in ragged pants. "You bring your God of punishment and judgment here again, and I will show you what a sinner can do. Now get out." Brother Josiah scrambled out of the snow, sputtering with indignation, his face purple with outrage. He saw the wild, unbroken spirit in her eyes and seemed to recognize that no sermon could tame it. Muttering curses about hellfire and fallen women, he clambered onto his horse and rode away, leaving Clara alone, trembling, but for the first time since the fire, feeling a surge of her own power. Her defiance gave her a new and desperate clarity. They needed feed for the cattle that had survived. They needed lumber to begin to patch the gaping hole in their lives. They needed money, and they had nothing. Nothing except the last relic of her old life. The next morning, while Luke was lost in a feverish sleep, she saddled the one remaining mule. She reached into the small wooden box where she kept her few possessions and took out her wedding ring. It was a simple gold band, worn thin over the years. It was the last tangible piece of her life with John, a symbol of a promise that had ended in ash. She slipped it into her pocket, her face set with a grim resolve. The ride to redemption was cold and lonely. The townspeople watched her pass with hostile eyes. She ignored them. Her focus narrowed to a single purpose. She walked into the general store, a place where she had once been met with kind, if pitying, words, and felt the temperature drop. She walked to the counter and placed the ring on the smooth, worn wood. "I need to sell this," she said to the proprietor, Mr. Abernathy, a man who had known her husband. He looked at the ring, then at her, his face a mixture of pity and disapproval. "Clara, are you sure?" he asked, his voice low. "This is..." "This is John's ring." "John is dead," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "My son is dead. My home is gone. This is just a piece of metal. I need feed and lumber. I will take what you think is fair." The transaction was made in a grim silence. She left the store with a few dollars in her pocket and a fistful of credit for supplies, leaving the last ghost of her past behind on the counter. She did not feel sorrow. She felt a strange, fierce liberation. She was no longer Clara Hensley, the widow. She was just Clara, a woman fighting for a future. With the money, she bought what she could. She worked alongside Luke as soon as he was strong enough to stand. His body still weak, but his spirit ignited by her unwavering determination. They began to rebuild. It was different this time. When they had worked on the ruins of her old home, they had been clearing away the past. Now, they were building a future, from the ground up. The work was slower, hampered by the winter and their own depleted strength, but there was a new quality to their labor. There was less fear and more resolve. They worked in a quiet, harmonious rhythm, each anticipating the other's needs, their shared purpose a silent language between them, their shared pain. Once a source of division and silent sorrow, became a strange kind of mortar, binding them together. It was a foundation more solid than stone. They had both seen the worst the world could do, had both been consumed by their own private fires. Having survived, they found a strange and resilient hope in the ruins. It was a promise forged in the heart of their shared destruction. As long as they were together, they could not be broken. One night, after a long day of clearing frozen, blackened timber, they sat by the hearth, their bodies aching with a satisfying weariness. The fire in the hearth was low, its gentle light painting their faces in soft shades of orange and gold. For a long time, they were silent, the only sound the crackle of the logs and the sigh of the wind outside. Luke was staring into the flames, his expression thoughtful, a deep and profound sadness in his eyes, but a new peace as well. He turned to look at her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "I've spent half my life being afraid of fire," he admitted, his voice a soft, rough whisper. "The stampede, the fire that took my family. I've spent years trying to put them out, trying to control the flames." He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. "But you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. "You're the only flame I don't want to put out." His words went straight to her heart, a warmth that spread through her entire body. All the walls she had built around herself, all the defenses she had used to survive, they all melted away in the heat of his gaze. She began to shiver, not from the cold, but from the sheer force of her feelings for him. The phrase that had been her nightmare, her terrified plea, rose to her lips. But this time, it was transformed. It was no longer about the past. It was about the future. It was a prayer, a vow, a confession of her own. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling as a single tear traced a path down her cheek. "Please don't leave me burning." He closed the small space between them, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her into an embrace that was the answer to every question she had ever had. It was an embrace that felt like forgiveness. Forgiveness for the lantern she had left by the window. Forgiveness for the boy he could not save. Forgiveness for a world that had once turned so cruel. They held each other, two scarred and broken people who had somehow, against all odds, found a way to make each other whole again. As the days grew longer, the iron grip of winter began to loosen. The sun felt warmer on their faces, and the great white expanse of the prairie began to show hints of the earth beneath. The snow melted, slowly at first, then in a great rush, the sound of trickling and running water, a song of rebirth. The frozen rivers broke apart with a sound like thunder, and the prairie, so long dormant, began to show the faintest blush of green. Spring was returning to the land. One clear, cool morning, Luke saddled the mule. He did not say where they were going. He simply helped her up and led the way. He took her back to the site of her first home, the place where her life had been reduced to ash. The snow had melted away, revealing the blackened foundation. But something new was there as well, pushing up through the charred earth. Fragile but determined were the first green shoots of spring wildflowers. Life was returning, even here. From a saddlebag, Luke took a small cloth sack. It was filled with seeds, wildflower seeds, and seeds for a small vegetable garden. He handed it to her. Together, they knelt in the ashes of her past. They did not speak. They simply worked, pushing the small seeds into the dark, fertile earth, their hands side by side. They were planting new life where death had reigned, a quiet, hopeful promise that even after the most devastating fire, something beautiful could grow again. The months that followed were a testament to the quiet, stubborn resilience of life. As spring bled into a long, warm summer, the land began to heal itself. The prairie, scarred and blackened by the fires, erupted in a riot of color. The wildflower seeds they had planted in the ashes of Clara's old homestead took root, blooming into a breathtaking carpet of Indian paintbrush, bluebonnets, and prairie roses. It was a defiant garden, a beautiful scar, a testament to the idea that life could not only survive destruction, but could grow from its very heart. They rebuilt the barn, not as it was, but smaller and sturdier, its fresh pine boards smelling of sweat and sap, and a future they were building with their own 4 hands. The work was slow, but their shared purpose was a quiet, powerful engine. Their resilience did not go unnoticed. The people of redemption, who had once whispered and condemned, began to watch them with a new, grudging respect. When Luke and Clara rode into town for supplies, the hostile stares were replaced by quiet, hesitant nods. The women who had pulled their skirts away now met Clara's gaze, a flicker of acknowledgement in their eyes. Mr. Abernathy, the store owner, made a point of giving them a sack of his best coffee beans at no charge, muttering gruffly, "For all your hard work." It was not friendship, not yet, but it was the beginning of acceptance. They had faced the fire, both literal and figurative, and had not been broken, in a land where survival was the highest virtue. Their endurance had earned them a place. The gossip had burned itself out, leaving behind the clean ash of respect. One day in late summer, a polished black buggy, a sight as out of place as a diamond in a dust storm, made its way up the long track to the ranch. Luke's brother, Elias, had returned from the east. This time, he did not come with offers and warnings, but with an air of weary concession. He was a man of contracts and courtrooms, but even he could recognize a force more powerful than a railroad charter. He and Luke sat at the small kitchen table, the silence between them less hostile than it had been, filled now with the weight of unspoken years. Clara served them coffee and then left them to their business, understanding that this was a conversation that had been a lifetime in the making. From outside, she could hear the low murmur of their voices. When Elias finally emerged, his face was softer. The hard lines of the lawyer eased into something more like a brother. "He is the most stubborn man I have ever known," Elias said to Clara, a hint of admiration in his voice. "The railroad will have its way, as it always does, but it will go around his valley, not through it." He explained the deal they had struck. Luke would grant the railroad limited grazing rights on the far eastern edge of his property, a concession that cost him little. In return, the company would officially redraw its line and pay him a handsome fee for the rights, more than enough to cover his debts and rebuild what he had lost. "They are paying for the peace," Elias explained. "And my brother, he has finally won." With the threat of the railroad gone and their future secure, a new sense of peace settled over the valley. And in that peace, Clara found a new purpose. The few families scattered in the surrounding territory had children who needed an education, with some of the money from the railroad. Luke helped her build a small, one-room schoolhouse on a gentle rise of land not far from the cabin. It was a simple, sturdy building with large windows that let in the vast prairie light. The first day she stood before her 5 pupils, a mix of shy, sun-browned farm children. Her heart was full of a feeling she had not expected as she taught them their letters, as she read them stories and watched their eyes widen with wonder. She felt the hollow place in her heart begin to fill. The love she had for Samuel, a love she thought had been buried with him, was not gone. It was a deep, inexhaustible well, and now she had found a place to pour it. Teaching these children, nurturing their minds and spirits, gave a new and beautiful meaning to her loss. She was creating a legacy of hope and knowledge, a quiet testament to the son she could not save. But peace, she learned, did not mean the absence of scars. The memory of the fire was a ghost that still walked in the dark corners of her mind. Some nights, the smell of wood smoke from their own hearth or the flicker of a lantern in the wind would be enough to send her spiraling back into the terror. She would wake up trembling, her heart racing, the screams of the past echoing in her ears. On those nights, Luke would hold her. He would wrap his strong arms around her, pulling her back from the edge, his solid presence a shield against the phantoms. He would not dismiss her fears with easy platitudes. He would simply hold her, his warmth seeping into her, his steady heartbeat a calming rhythm against her back. "It's all right, Clara," he would whisper into her hair, his voice a low, comforting rumble in the darkness. "I'm here. The fire's behind us. You're safe now. You're safe." And she would cling to him, the man who had become her shelter. And slowly, the trembling would subside, and she would believe him. As autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and russet, the town of Redemption held its annual harvest gathering. It was a celebration of survival, a grateful nod to the land for another year of sustenance. For the first time, Luke asked Clara to go with him. The thought filled her with a familiar dread. To face all those people, to feel their eyes on her, to stand in the middle of their community as an outsider, it was a daunting prospect. But when she looked at Luke's hopeful face, she knew she could not refuse. For him, and for them, she would be brave. They rode into town as dusk was settling, the sky a soft, violet tapestry. The main street was alive with light and laughter. Strings of lanterns were hung between the buildings, their warm, golden glow casting a magical light on the faces of the townspeople. Music from a fiddle and a guitar spilled out of the town hall, a lively, joyful sound that invited everyone to forget their hardships for a single night. When they walked into the hall, a hush fell over the crowd. The music faltered for a beat. The whispers, which had once been so cruel, were silenced. Every eye turned to them, to the quiet rancher and the woman they had called the fire widow. Clara's first instinct was to shrink away, to retreat back into the safety of the shadows. But then Luke reached for her hand. He did not just take it, he threaded his fingers through hers, his grip firm and steady, and held it up for all to see. It was a simple gesture, but it was a public declaration. It said, without a single word, "She is with me. She is mine. We are together. Judge us if you dare." And in that moment, the town's judgment finally broke. A few people smiled. Someone nodded a greeting. The fiddler, taking a deep breath, struck up a new tune, a slow, gentle waltz. The spell was broken. They were no longer outcasts. They were simply neighbors. Luke led her to the center of the floor, under the soft, forgiving glow of the lanterns. He pulled her close. The light that had twice been her destroyer was now a thing of beauty, a tender warmth that promised community and celebration, not destruction. As they danced, moving slowly to the rhythm of the waltz, Clara rested her head against Luke's shoulder. She looked around at the faces in the room, at the warm lantern light, at the strong, steady man who was holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And the tears that she had been unable to cry at her own son's grave finally came. They were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude, of release, of a joy so profound it was almost painful. They slipped down her face, hot and cleansing, washing away the last of the ash that had clung to her soul. Luke felt her tears and pulled back slightly, his gray eyes filled with a gentle concern. She looked up at him, a watery, brilliant smile breaking through her tears. The music swelled around them, and in that perfect, luminous moment, she understood everything. She understood the pain, the loss, the fires. They had not been just an ending. They had been a brutal, agonizing, but necessary beginning. "Maybe," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion but clear as a bell. "Maybe burning was the only way to begin again." Luke's answering smile was all the confirmation she needed. He leaned down and kissed her, a soft, reverent kiss filled with all the unspoken promises of their future. The story closes on the two of them, much later, walking hand in hand along the ridge that overlooked their small, quiet valley. The sun was setting, a spectacular blaze of orange and red and gold that set the western sky on fire. The light was glorious, painting the clouds in shades of flame, a beautiful, peaceful inferno that held no terror. They stood side by side, leaving behind the long shadows of their past, leaving behind the ashes and their fears. His arm was around her shoulder, hers around his waist. Their love, born in the crucible of tragedy and forged in the fires of hardship, had become the one thing they both craved, a quiet, steady flame that would never destroy. It would only endure. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are from in the comments to connect with fellow listeners. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.